Good morning and welcome to Scotland Speaks at our usual time of 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and there's lots happening in Scotland and in ALBA. So a reminder that 12 noon tomorrow, that is Sunday, is the deadline for your nominations for all of our party office bearers, from leader to deputy leader to our office bearers across the different conveners and of course our ordinary members. So get nominating so we can look forward to some great contests and some great hustings. We've had a tremendous response to last week's show featuring one of ALBA Party's newest members, Angus Brendan McNeill. Here's a taste of what he had to say in last week's show.
He was a leader that sort of tried to lift up and propel those around him. You know, I've come across leaders who kind of insecure and want to stand on the shoulders of the others around them and kind of push them down so they get to an apex. Alec was trying to bring everybody up because he wasn't threatened by anybody. I've come across leaders that have been threatened by people or insecure or uncertain, but Alec was secure and he was certain and he was trying to lift everybody around about him. I do remember a Labour MP from Glenrothes, John McDougall, God rest him, he's dead now. He stopped me one day. I didn't know who he was. He introduced himself and he said, "You're over in Alex Salmond's group," because they were in government and could see us over. I says, "Yeah, I am." He says, "You're very lucky. Pay attention." I thought, he says, "Yeah, people like him are scarce. So you pay attention to him and try and learn what you can." So I walked away from that wondering.
And here are your messages. Kizzywiz says, "Great to hear that Angus Brendan has joined ALBA. Look forward to seeing him at the ALBA conference. I'm so glad that you're keeping this programme going. It's a very important programme to keep us independence-minded people going because the dream shall never die." James says, "Alex was a legend. Let's hope Angus takes over from him, who is also a legend in my opinion." Well, I'll pass that on. He'll be very pleased to hear that. Mohab says, "Thank you for the interesting show for this week. I'm following, watching and supporting you guys from New York City. Good to hear." Geronimo says, "Great show. Really interesting about Gordon Brown. A great story. Keep up the good work for Scotland." Brian Trainer says, "Thoroughly enjoyed this week's episode, Taz. I really enjoyed listening to Angus and of course yourself." Thank you, Brian. Dan says, "We need our own sovereignty." Well, and so see all of us, Dan. Michael says, "We could have total autonomy in a week. There is a way. Explain it to the voters." Grant says, "If there's not going to be another referendum, the election should be treated as one. That means pro-independence parties to secure 50% plus of the vote, not 50% plus of MSPs, by gaming the system." Kevin says, "The Scottish Grand Committee could have met and ended the union when you all had a majority in previous elections. Why did you not use it then?" Well, I can understand the frustration. Thank you very much indeed for all of your messages. Please do keep them coming in. And now to this week's show and another firebrand. It gives me great pleasure to say that we're going to be joined this week by Fergus Ewing, stalwart of the independence movement and of course son of the inimitable, wonderful Madame Ecosse. To hear from Fergus, stay tuned and we'll see you after the break. Welcome back to Scotland Speaks, and I'm delighted to be joined by Fergus Ewing. Fergus, welcome to Scotland Speaks.
It's a pleasure.
It's very good to see you, Fergus. Obviously, the last interview you had with Alex was at the IMAX cinema, which we'll come back to. But a very close and dear friend. We've We've promised on this show that for as long as the show is on air, we'll continue to talk about Alex. This was to show his idea and about his plans for an independent Scotland and achieving it as quickly as possible. So we're very keen to hear from you. Some of your most excellent stories I know you'll have about Alex.
Yeah, well, there isn't a day that goes by, Tasmina, without somebody expressing sadness and how much they admired and enjoyed Alex's company when they knew him. But I guess I have known Alex since 1981, and then went on the National Executive Committee in the days when the SNP was quite a happy band and a band of volunteers. He led the party at the first time, and I was on the National Executive. So we worked very, very closely together, and have many fond memories. Above all, Alec liked people, and when he met someone, he was always interested to find out about them and share his views and make it a memorable experience, not an exchange of banal platitudes. And there's a lovely story that I retailed at the family funeral service, which was he was on a visit once to a factory which had a machine shop with 90 workers producing heavy subsea equipment for the oil industry. And one of the 90 workers was a girl. And the BBC cameras were filming the visit for the news that evening, because he was the boss, First Minister. And they wanted him to speak to the female employee, which he did. And she talked about her work and how she enjoyed it. When the cameras went off, now most politicians would just have left, stage left, and disappeared. But he carried on talking, so he was generally interested. And the girl had said that she was doing well, she had a boyfriend, they were hoping to get married, buy a house and all the rest of it. So he said, he asked her this, and what does your boyfriend think about you working with 89 blokes? And which she replied, he thinks I'm a hairdresser.
That is so typically.
And he roared with laughter, of course. And you know, he would go around the shows and games around Scotland. And I remember he came to Granton once and with Moira, and you know, he had a splendid time. And everybody he talked to, he had a happy story, a smile, an exchange. It was a very memorable day. But you know, for Alec, there was 10,000 Granton shows. He did that his whole life. When he became First Minister, I think he was early on, one of the first things he did was to work with Prince Charles, now His Majesty the King, to convert and restore and turn Dumfries House into a magnificent abode and attraction for visitors as well. So the civil service at that point strongly advised that he shouldn't provide any assistance for this project. And
why did the civil service always say no, Fergus, to good ideas?
I think there's something in the blood. I don't know whether they have an induction at the new club in Edinburgh. There's lots of kind of ordinary Scots that should be promoted to Sir Humphrey, but haven't been at the right school, I think, or the right university down in England somewhere. But no, Alex was advised by the civil service, no, that's a bad idea, First Minister, for various reasons. There's always about 20 reasons not to do something. And he thought it was a good idea, but he also wanted to prove I'm the boss as well. And now, Tasmina, Dumfries House is hugely popular. In fact, it's one of the largest employers in the south of Scotland. So Alec was almost always right, but he was always brave. He wasn't afraid to do something, as so seems to be the case with the current administration, that our stasis is the word only word I can really think of. But I think the thing he was proudest of all the things he achieved, and I know this because he said so, the way he put it was, he said, if I ever find myself at the pearly gates and my maker asked me this question, what did you do with your life? He said, my answer would be, I helped raise the Sapphire, the fishing boat that capsized because of a freak wave not too far from the shore as it was bringing in its catch, with 4 of the crew who died. The skipper, who was above deck, you know, navigating the boat, survived, and the tale of how Alec managed to achieve what people thought was impossible is something of which he was immensely proud, and rightly so. And you know, when I was cabinet secretary, I was involved in something not dissimilar with the Nancy Glen, a smaller boat in a capsized off Tarbert, and that's something that I was very proud of that we managed to accomplish, and it was very difficult. So it all went back to looking after people with Alec. That was number one for him, and why I think he's so loved and revered now and will be for forever, frankly.
Now you mentioned bravery, and being brave was very important, and an important factor of leadership is thinking about doing things that are important and meaningful. And as part of, you know, Alex's legacy, you'll often see on social media that the SNP will detail all sorts of SNP achievements as if they're things that have happened in the past few years, when so many of those were Alex's achievements.
Well, one of the really quite shocking and very sad things is that Alex seems to have been erased from the history of the SNP. My colleagues, even those who, like me, were colleagues, comrades in the old days when none of us, frankly, expected to get elected. We did it out of a burning desire to see Scotland regain our independence. We didn't do it because we thought we'd have a cushy number in Holyrood. So none of them mention him. None of them speak about him. None of them praise him. And the irony is that without him as leader, they wouldn't have had their jobs. They owe their success to him. But, you know, my late father had a favourite saying, never do anyone a favour, they'll never forgive you.
If we look back, Fergus, at that time when the SNP were struggling to make any headway, and Alex's role at that time to his role as First Minister, did he change at all as a person in that period of time, or as a personality, given the challenges that he faced in both roles?
He was always larger than life. He was demanding, but of course he was demanding. He was the First Minister. It's not a cushy number. Problems are coming at you every day in all directions. And he expected people to work hard and to deliver. And if they didn't, they were out. And, you know, what's wrong with that? It just doesn't happen much these days. Nobody ever carries the can. There's no can carrier in the Scottish Government, or any quango for that matter.
Well, Alex demanded, of course, Fergus, hard work, because that's what he did. You know, if he was working independence isn't a part-time cause. No. It's a full-time job that we're all determined to achieve for Scotland, and what's the space for part-time engagement in that? And so he expected that of people who worked in and around him. It seems that some people found that a rather difficult concept.
You know, and he would give people a ticking off when they failed in some way. I mean, I had it once or twice, and I deserved it. I mean, I had to accept it. I didn't. I didn't demur from that in any way, but most of the time he was just great company and always worth listening to. Very few politicians these days seem to have anything interesting, humorous to say, or of any particular insights. There's a sort of series of platitudinous piffle that you get, which is a substitute for original thought, or even interesting allusions, metaphors, and so on. But
historical references, of course, is that
historical references. It was an historian, really, as well. But he also had the capacity to make you laugh out loud sometime. I mean, remember in the summer in the last general election campaign, and Douglas Ross was going to cease to be the leader of the Tories and instead go from Holyrood to Westminster in one smooth leap, whereby his colleague and a decent man, David Dogood, was pushed out of the way when he was in hospital, and this seemed a little bit odious to lots of people. And it was talked about on the radio one day. I was listening to the radio, and Alex said, "Well, you know, this is the first recorded instance in the modern annals of Scottish political history where a rat deserted a sinking ship only to clamber aboard a gravy train. And I laughed out loud and I thought, never have two metaphors been mixed to such good effect.
His ability to do that was absolutely incredible, but he was exceptionally exercised by the treatment of David Dogood, because it speaks to, I suppose, Fergus, you'll no doubt be able to elaborate even further, as to the type of person Alex was. He genuinely cared about people. Humanity mattered to him, relationships mattered to him, and he was able to see beyond the politics to the person behind.
Well, absolutely, and he had friends and admirers in all parties. I mean, you know, we know David Davis and Eleanor Lang, and you know, many people that I know in the Labour Party had a huge respect and often an affection, because you know, most of us do get on reasonably well behind the scenes, some more so than others, but he just hugely respected Tasmina, and it's just a tragedy, an enduring tragedy, that he's no longer with us, because much more to give, and the prospect of him coming back to Holyrood would have really reinvigorated the place, and my goodness, it needs a bit of vim and vigour reintroduced to it.
Of course, Fergus, it's a huge loss to us as a party, gargantuan, and I can't even conceive of it, what it means for ALBA, because we believe Scotland needed so much for Alex to be in that Parliament in 2026 and come back and do what needed to be done to achieve the dream of independence. You mentioned his impact on politicians across the political divide, but the time he spent with people, obviously it mattered to him just as much to spend time with ordinary people, the public in Scotland. And I remember him often telling me how much he learnt from your mother, the late great Winnie Ewing, about engaging with the public and how much he followed in her footsteps and understanding the importance of that.
Yeah, well, they got on really well and they were true friends, and Alec had great similarities with my mother, who was probably the most successful vote winner in the history of the SNP, because she loved dealing with people. That's what she liked. She wasn't really interested in policy. I think, if truth be told, sometimes she made it up on the hoof, and that was the policy for that particular moment. But that wasn't what was important. It was the spirit of Scotland. It was people's imagination and drive that she inspired. And you can't win a nation back unless leaders are able to do that. It's a sine qua non of success, or one of them anyway. And she and Alec had it. It was Brian Wilson, actually, that said Winnie was the most successful vote winner and campaigner of our time. And, you know, he's no supporter of Scottish nationalism. So they both were able to reach out to people. If they went to a posh event, they would each made sure that they would pop into the kitchen to speak to the staff and thank them at some point in the evening. And they wouldn't be shy about doing it. I mean, my mother was the first person to do factory visits in Hamilton, and she went round and spoke to all the women. And nobody had ever spoken to them before. They were expected to do what their husband wanted, you see, in those days. And Winnie was never of that ilk. So yes, they did love each other, actually. And Alec was always very generous to Winnie. And she was president for much of the time when he was leader the first time round.
And he delivered a very moving eulogy to Winnie at the memorial. And little did we know that so quickly after we would lose Alex also. But what he learned from Winnie, he used not just in the political forum, Fergus, but even when we were filming, whether it was in the studio or abroad, he would always make sure he spoke to everybody involved in the production team, not just, for instance, the director or who the editor might be, but absolutely everybody. And it's a characteristic that, you know, a lot of people could do well to learn from, about engaging with people at every level. But we're going to take a short break, Fergus, and then we're going to come back to the last interview that Alex conducted with yourself at the IMAX.
The IMAX, sure.
We'll see you after the break.
Water is life, but not all water is equal. Our water ionizer restructures and alkalizes water for optimum hydration and detoxification, recreating the planet's ultimate water sources, found in lightning-struck lakes and newly melted icebergs. H2 Pure Source. Change your water. Change your life.
Welcome back to Scotland Speaks, and I'm privileged and honoured to be joined by Fergus Ewing. Fergus, welcome back to part 2. I mentioned before the break that Alex interviewed you. His last interview with you was at the IMAX cinema in Glasgow on the 10th anniversary of the independence referendum. Let's just cut to some of the things you had to say at that event.
But again, it is serious, and if actually, I think we're all indebted in many ways to Wings Over Scotland, but not least for the blog of Gordon Dangerfield, who's now Alex's lawyer. But through just fate, Gordon wrote seriously about the events leading up to your being prosecuted in the criminal courts of Scotland as a former First Minister. If you read Gordon's blog, you will, I think, like myself, feel that there is a huge and the gravest of questions to answer about what has happened and the way in which our former First Minister was the subject of a concerted, deliberate campaign with the avowed intent, a declaration of war, no less, by the Permanent Secretary to ensure that this man was prosecuted and jailed. And I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is the scandal of our age. And myself and many other people here and who are not here are determined to devote every living breath to bringing about truth and justice for Alex Salmond.
Very moving, strong points you made to Alex at a time that I think he needed to hear them, and was grateful to hear them from you about the greatest political scandal of our age, which is what happened to Alex. You are still working with all of us to ensure that justice is delivered in that respect. And I wondered what your current thinking is of where we are in all of this. Now we don't have Alex with us.
Sure. Well, first of all, I've never been a conspiracy theorist. I've never believed in the grassy knoll or David Icke. I've always believed that there must be an evidence base for arguments you make. For things that you wish to see happen, you must use logic. I mean, after all, that's what the Scottish Enlightenment taught us. But in the case of the conspiracy against Alec, I have absolutely no doubt there was a concerted campaign against him, led by top government officials and conducted with the aim of destroying him, destroying his reputation, and ultimately seeing him accused, convicted and imprisoned. And just 3 short pieces of evidence which encapsulate this, and this is without precedent, is that the 3 very top people in different walks of life in Scotland have all said things either on or off the record which proves this. Lord Pentland, who delivered the judgment in favour of Alec in the Judicial Review, and who's now the top judge, the Lord President of Scotland, said about the Scottish Government that their behaviour was, quotes, tainted by apparent bias. I know of no other instance of a top judge in the Court of Session making any such political comment. Secondly, in that case, Roddy Dunlop, who was the Dean of the Faculty and the Scottish Government's lawyer, said, and it was private advice which he didn't have expected to be made public, that one of the very top civil servants had provided a draft sworn statement, an affidavit, which was going to be lodged in court as evidence. Now, Roddy said of this document, mercifully, it was never lodged. One can draw one's own conclusion about what underlay that word, mercifully. And last, but certainly not least, Leslie Evans, who was the permanent secretary throughout this conspiracy, on the day when the decision was released that she and her colleagues had lost the case that Alec brought against the Scottish government, said in a text to a senior official, "Battle lost, but we will win the war." So what I'm saying is that there's a whole lot of other evidence, but in what other case, Tasmina, can you think of that a political argument that this is in fact the greatest scandal of our age is backed up not just by senior people, but three of the top people in Scotland? And I think that's quite remarkable. So myself, along with many others, are engaged in the campaign to get justice for Alec, and I very much hope that we will see that sooner or later, and that the cover-up which has been going on even now, involving the Freedom of Information Commissioner, whose decisions are frankly being perverted and obstructed by the government, who brought in the Freedom of Information, or supported the Freedom of Information Act back at the beginning of devolution, that the truth will eventually out. And I do know that there's a great many people at a very senior level in Scotland that agree with me and yourself that there was a campaign against him.
Absolutely, and it's very poignant if we just go back to the evidence that Alex gave to the Scottish Parliament inquiry into the actions of the Scottish Government around the civil service investigation. He said something very important when he mentioned that it's not the people of Scotland who's failed or Scotland itself, it's the institutions in Scotland which are failing people. And we see that increasingly, even not specifically in reference with what happened to Alex, but in every day what's going on now in Scotland, that there seems to be a failing of institutions. And I firmly believe, whether you're a nationalist or whether you just believe in the importance of the Scottish Parliament and Scottish Government and our own Scots Parliament, how important it is for the truth to get out so Scotland can move on, hopefully in our view, as an independent country. But people have fundamentally lost faith in the various institutions in carrying out the job that they're required to do.
Well, I think these last 4 years have been the wasted years. They've been the years of disillusionment, because I do think, and it's not personal, that the Scottish Government have really destroyed their own reputation over the last 4 years, not least by entering into a pact with the extremist Greens that was manifestly dire. A pact for which the current First Minister was the architect, incidentally, of the deal, but also obsession with things which to most people seem to be peripheral. I mean, everybody in Scotland that I know wants to be treated with reasonable courtesy and respect, and everybody to be treated that way, irrespective of who they are, what they come from, what their skin colour is, what their personal views are. But for this to have become such an apparent obsession, so that we sit up till 1 a.m. on voting on transgender issues, I know very few people who are not mystified and baffled, but also angry that we're not focusing on sorting out the bread and butter basics and getting the huge problems in our public services sorted out. Even finding a couple of ferries to buy at a reasonable price might be quite a good start. I can't imagine, Tasmina, that Alec would have got involved in a single item like this. Not one example, not for 1 minute. And increasingly, when I speak to people in Scotland, they say, it's a shame that Alec wasn't the boss. He did well for Scotland. I hear that every day from people, particularly people who are actually not necessarily SNP, but who managed to be persuaded that an independent Scotland under his leadership, we could make a go of it. And that's so important. And And the SNP at best is flatlining at the moment. In some ways, it's become a bit of a hindrance towards achieving independence, because this is a point I believe very strongly. When devolutionists seem to be doing well, the SNP or the independence cause does well. When devolutionists seem to be performing badly or poorly, then the converse is true, and it puts people off wanting more powers. It's logical. It's very straightforward. And at the moment, we're kind of in the doldrums. And, as I said at the show in the Fringe in Edinburgh, which Alec invited me to, and which you were fully involved as well in taking part, I said that the SNP is going through a kind of late adolescence. But the thing about being a teenager is that the teenage years do come to an end. So we will see if they do come to an end, or if it's sort of perpetuated, as I fear it may be at the moment.
Alex was of the view, Fergus, in these elections to come up now in 2026, that they should be treated like an independence election, an independence majority, super majority, if you will, which was the phraseology we used in 2021, was key to achieving that. How likely do you think that is in the current circumstances, or how quickly can the SNP move from adolescence to being grown up to enable that to happen?
I don't really see it's possible to do it very quickly. I wish it were, but the reason I say that is that for most of my life and Alec's life, and I've 50 years in the SNP as he was, we were building up trust, Tasmina. It was a gradual process of getting to the top of the mountain, and we nearly got there in 2014. And he left the legacy of that support for independence. I mean, he was the architect of that trust that was built up. He created that, he achieved that, and then he bequeathed that. And that legacy has been squandered. It's been frittered away. It took a long time to build up. It dissipated over 10 years. That's the way I see it. And trust is a commodity that you have to earn through your actions. And because we've blown that trust by stupidities in the last 4 years in particular, I mean, betrayal of our fishermen. I mean, my mother would be burning in her grave. The HPMAs, the deposit return scheme, the ferries, all these problems collectively have had an impact. So we need to build back trust. I think we need to focus on a 10-year economic plan to build up economic growth. We need to do, as Jim Sullers has pointed out, to answer the specific questions about why people didn't vote for us in 2014. That's never happened. The issues about pensions, the division of pensions, is actually quite a straightforward issue in principle to explain. In practice, it will take a period of, say, 5-10 years to have a disaggregation. But that could be spelt out to people. It never has been. It's been ignored. Frankly, ignored by the leadership in the party that should have come up with answers. So we need to come up with the answers about why people voted no. They're really related to the economy. We need to build a strong economy, and that's the absolutely essential element for people to feel that Scotland will be better off under independence. The irony is that the opportunity now to do that has been greater in some ways because of the complete and utter incompetence of the current UK government under Mr Stammer, who people expected to be competent but boring. Instead, he's boring and incompetent. So there's never been a greater opportunity to say, look, we can do it better ourselves. But unless we can prove that we can run the show as it is in Edinburgh to much better, as Alec did from 2007 to 2014, then I think there's a real risk that we might, as a cause, move backward. So I'm not a person that thinks that, having a formula about the trigger for independence at the ballot is the key question. The key question is trust, and that means building people's confidence back that we can run the show better in Edinburgh. In a way, it doesn't really matter if it's the SNP in government or the SNP with a grand coalition, which I've suggested. In some ways, it might be better to work with all other main parties, not the Greens, not the extremists. They stay in the kindergarten or the wine bar, wherever it is they go. But with the main parties and That's what people want. People always say, I wish you guys could just work together. I actually do that a lot in the Highlands, and people like it a lot. We won a wee campaign in the health service locally in Granton, and what people were writing to me about was, well, I don't necessarily vote at SNP, but the way that you worked with Labour and the Conservatives in that campaign was what we want. So I think we've become too tribal. And the last thing I would say is that for the SNP and ALBA to be at each other's throats is absolute madness. We should be working with each other as sister parties for the same cause. It's so logical, and I don't know why it doesn't happen. I've suggested it happens, and like most of the suggestions I've made over the past 4 years, it's been at first ignored, but they agree with me. They agree with me usually at the end after they found out they were wrong.
Well, I'm hoping that the end is going to come sooner than the elections in 2026, Fergus, because it's absolutely essential for the cause of Scottish independence, and indeed to restore what was great faith in the Scottish Parliament for doing great things. Yep. That we need to have coalitions of people of experience, of knowledge, of understanding to enhance the reputation and build up the reputation of the Scottish Parliament, which has been distracted, and that's a kind word, in other issues. How much, in relation to issues, have the continuing inability of the SNP and its ministers and First Ministers to define what a woman is, has that affected the heart and soul of the SNP and the electorate's impression of it?
I think it's had a huge effect, and leading members of the SNP, Jo Cherry, who people greatly admire for what she achieved in her legal challenge, Joe McAlpin, Michelle Thompson, many other really formidable women in the SNP have either been sidelined or very, very poorly treated. And
aren't standing for election again.
Indeed, indeed so, and that's a huge loss. But, you know, women are over half the population, and a very large proportion of them feel that the way in which the gender issue has been handled has been quite insulting to them as women, and feel very, very strongly about it. So yes, let's treat everyone with respect, but let's get back to doing what we should do and concentrating on the main things. And I mean, you know, recently they've had things like banning greyhound racing or banning pet cats. I mean, isn't it a time in Scotland that we run out of things to ban or make free?
I think the pet cats thing was a bit of a joke. However, what was interesting is that there was a period of time where people thought it was possible that was on the table because of some of the stuff that they'd seen had gone before. But let's look to the positives, Fergus, because that's what Alex would ask us to do. The dream shall never die, he said, believed in independence all of his life, and it's incumbent on us to ensure that dream is delivered. What do you think we need to do? Because we owe it to Alex and his memory and to the people of Scotland. What do we need to do to achieve that?
Well, I think we need to be honest and accept when things have gone wrong. A bit of humility wouldn't go amiss. I've made no secret about it. I do think that Kate Forbes has the person that has the combination of sharpness, intellect, hard work, passion, absolute honesty and principle to be a fine leader for Scotland. And there are many others, I think, that can do that. And, you know, I look around other parties, and there are people in all the main parties that I greatly admire and like and I'm friendly with. And, you know, I think we really should be, as grown-ups, working better across parties. Try to cut out the tribalism. You can't excise that from politics, but it can be done with a cheery smile rather than a sort of grimace. It can be done without the snash that seems to be the kind of lingua franca at First Minister's question time, to something a bit more elevating, surely.
You'd mentioned that you think the SNP should work with ALBA, ALBA should work with the SNP. Do you then, if you see Kate as a future good leader, that she would engage with ALBA in a positive way?
I think she would. She engages with everybody in a positive way, and you know, she's no slouch either. She will defend her ground. But I mean, I've been a friend of Kate's and known her when she was even younger, and seen her develop and feel that she has the personal qualities. And the treatment of her in the leadership campaign was one of the most obnoxious things I've ever seen in the SNP. It demeaned those who attacked her, quite frankly. I've never really thought that personal attacks take you very far in politics, unless there's perhaps a bit of humour or self-deprecation involved. And the attacks on her because she was a Christian in a country that has a background of Christianity, whilst welcoming people of all different faiths. Surely Christians are not excluded from the highest office in Scotland. It certainly felt that way at the time, which was utterly baffling and wholly wrong.
Fergus, thank you so much for joining me. I know how sad this has all been for you and continues to be for you. The passing of Alex is a huge loss to us all and to Scotland, but we can certainly unite, as many of us can, around two fundamental things: justice for Alex Salmond and independence for Scotland.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fergus. And with that, we come to the end of this week's episode of Scotland Speaks. I do hope you've enjoyed the show. Please do write in with your comments and thoughts on today's interview and ideas for future episodes. Next week, I'm looking forward to being joined in the studio by Colin McInnes of the Homeless Project Scotland, which Alex visited on a number of occasions, dishing out food and spending time with people in need of help. How very Alex Salmond. See you all next week. Thank you.